Hopkins, my favourite poet. Hopefully you've watched the videos on the individual poems, and hopefully this mind map is not going to be as long as some of the other ones, and I do apologise about them. Hopefully the editing people will be able to chop them up a bit. If I get a bit enthusiastic here, I apologise. I just love this guy. As I told you before, one of the greatest lines I've ever read is from The Windhover, in which Hopkins talks about his response to seeing this bird. He says, "My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing." And for me, that's kind of how I feel when I read his poetry. So look, you don't care about that. You're preparing for your leaving cert, and I hope that you're finding the preparations going well. This guy's just worth reading. He's just worth reading. He's worth writing about. By the way, I have a very good sense that he's going to be on your leaving cert this year. So that's 2025 I'm talking about. So hopefully I'm right. So these are the poems by Hopkins that I teach. Spring, the wind hover, no worse there is none, pitched past pitch of grief. I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day, Felix Randall and God's grandeur. Now don't forget there are more poems than that prescribed for each poet. If you cover 5 or 6 poems, you're sorted. So hopefully that, if you're doing Hopkins, and I really would love to think you were, that this will, those 6 poems will parallel with some of the poems that you're preparing. Remember that when you're looking at this guy is all about technique. Well, sorry, not all about technique, but technically he was just a master craftsman. Dickinson and Hopkins have a lot in common, even though they've so much that makes them different. But just in terms of technique, like unique and genius, and I don't use that word lightly. So the poems that I teach, they're all sonnets. They're all Petrarchan sonnets, where there's an octave in which there's kind of a situation is outlined, and there's a sestet, which is kind of a reflection. They don't all fit with that. Some of the sestets are divided into 3-line tercet stanzas, but essentially that's the structure of the poems. And the poems are incredibly rhythmic. He is a poet whose work is hallmarked by the inventive and enthusiastic use of techniques which create rhythm. Things like rhyming, alliteration, sibilance, meter, and you might know a bit about sprung rhythm. Don't get bogged down in that. It's not something I will talk about it in this video, but it's something I wouldn't necessarily, if I was you, let distract me. Maybe when you go to 3rd level and you're getting down into the granular detail of someone like Hopkins, you might go and look at that. But anyway, the fact is that his work is often musical and certainly always rhythmic. There's always a beat, there's always a flow, there's always a sense of rhythm to these poems. He is a poet whose first lines are unbelievably striking. Often they open with these declarations, with this declaratory tone. Often they're highly inventive, the openings, and they're like pieces of argumentative writing, where there's a thesis, and the thesis is expounded in the first line, and the rest of the poem is given over to proving that. So the world is charged with the grandeur of God, from God's grandeur. I mean, that's a wow, what a confident declaratory tone that is. Like he's not taking any questions on it. It's real for him. This is it's electrifying, his experience of the world and his sense of God's presence in it. Nothing is so beautiful as spring. I mean, just look at that amazing imperative tone. He's in charge. He knows what's going on. He knows that this is the case. There's no question that this is true. The unusual, I caught this morning's minion. There, it's not a declaration, but it's deliberately designed to create curiosity, like the repetition of morning and the 2 different uses of that word. The first one, like talking about the time of the day. The second one talking about the bird being the servant of the dawn. There's loads going on there. If you watch the video of that, you'll understand it. The declaration from the terrible sonnet, no worse there is none, pitched past pitch of grief. The certainty that there's nothing worse than what he's feeling right now. So this is Hopkins. It's something that you can link the poems together. The opening lines are incredibly striking, often declaratory or imperative in tone, and certainly designed to be striking and to provoke curiosity. Repetition is a feature of his poetry. See it over and over again. It's a defining, as far as I'm concerned, a defining feature of his style. And of course, repetition is, in terms of ideas, it's used great emphasis. In terms of sounds, it creates rhythm. And his use of repetition is very, very effective. And you see it across the poems. In Felix Randall, the repetition of pining, just capturing that almost in an onomatopoeic sense, that the visceral suffering that Felix has experienced and that the priest Hopkins has witnessed as he's these fatal 4 disorders tear him apart. In I Wake and Feel the Fell of Dark Not Day, he says, my lament is cries countless, and then he says cries again, and the repetition of cries, capturing his trauma, capturing his pain, capturing, the intensity of what he's experiencing. In No Worse There Is None, oh the mind has mountains, that repetition of mind there, focusing on the psychological experience, the stress that he's experiencing, the sense of awe, of how difficult it is to understand, the extent of what he's experiencing, drawing attention to that line. The mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, no man fathomed. Incredible. In the Windhover, just to capture the majesty and control of the bird, it can hover there and then off on a swing, and the repetition of off captures the speed with which the bird can go from hovering to diving down to its prey. And then in the wonderful God's Grandeur, when he thinks about the humans and our experience of the world, he says generations have trod, and that really just captures something of his sense that human experience is not one that is joyous and celebratory, that is not one which is fulfilling, that it's a trudge, it's challenging, that it's difficult, it's not rewarding. And he doesn't understand why we live like that when we could embrace, in his worldview, the wonder of God through appreciation of nature. So there is no doubt that repetition is an important feature of his poetry. This is the most important slide in this presentation and in your Hopkins mind map that's in your paper 2 notebook. Just learn some of these symbols. I would always advise students, when you're preparing a poem, learn a symbol per poem and be able to explain what the symbol represents, and be able to talk about how the symbol or the use of metaphor or figurative language or synecdoche, whatever it is. And I'll do a video on what all those things mean, actually. I know you probably do know already, but you might not. So I'll do a video on what each one of those terms means. But there's just so much vivid symbolism in this guy's poetry. I can't show you them all, but that's a synecdoche there. Nor can foot feel being shod. Watch the God's Grandeur video and you'll see what that means. In the Windhover, brute beauty, just that oxymoron, that unusual adjective combination of adjectives to describe the bird, which captures something not only of the nature of the bird, but also of the nature of life. In No Worse There Is None, his compound adjective, world sorrow. That idea that his suffering has, it's all encompassing. There is nothing else in the world when he's experiencing it. So this is a guy who uses symbolism incredibly effectively, in a striking, original, thought-provoking way. It's a defining feature of his poetry in my experience. If you don't understand what any of those mean, first of all, you can ask me in the live classes. Secondly, just go and watch the video on each one of those individual poems. Simile. It's probably, the literary device that you learned probably earliest in your career as an English student in primary school, the comparison using like or as to give concrete form to an abstract idea. It's a brilliant technique, and he does it brilliantly. In I Wake and Feel the Fell of Dark Not Day, he says that his cries, and remember we talked about cries, like dead letters sent to dearest him that lives, alas, away. I mean, wow, that's a brilliant simile. A dead letter is a letter, and again, if you watch the video, you'll see a letter that is sent to an address that no longer exists, so the person cannot receive the communication. And it's his way of saying that his prayers are not being heeded, that God has no longer listened to him, that he feels abandoned. It's a brilliantly inventive use of Similarly, in the wind hover I mentioned, then off, the repetition, and then that's followed with as a skate's heel sweeps smooth in a bow bend. You know, it's such a visual image, that simile, the image of the skate, ice skate as it flies around the frozen body of water, and the smooth transit of the skate, you know, sweeping smooth, the sibilance of the S's there. A brilliant simile which captures something of the speed and the ease with which the bird moves. In spring, talking about hearing the song of the thrush in springtime, he says it strikes like lightning because it's electrifying. It's impossible to ignore. It's a force of nature. It captures, you know, the sense that when he hears this song, the thrill it gives him, the impossible to ignore impact of this song. And then in God's grandeur again, he says, you know, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. And again, a brilliant simile. And like this image of, it's so, you know, it's complex and yet so easy to understand, you know. So something oozes. It's a process which is slow, and you have to be patient and gradual. Like if you're squeezing olives to get the oil out of them, it's a process that takes time, and that's like, you know, being aware of God's presence. Sometimes it strikes like lightnings, but other times it's like the ooze of oil crushed. You know, really, 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 really clever writing by this brilliant, talented writer. Is he a lyric poet? I would argue yes, even though I don't really like the phrase lyric poet. You know, there's your definition of lyric poetry: a short poem which the poet's persona or another speaker expresses personal feelings. And there is no doubt that Hopkins writes short poems, and there is no doubt that he, in a most inventive and confessional way, talks about his experience of life. Look at his, in God's grandeur, his sense of how unpleasant life can be. All is seared, bleared, smeared with toil. That, you know, our obsession with material things and money and economy, you know, stains the world. In the wind hover, my heart in hiding. In spring, the idea that the beauty becomes cloyed, that like milk, it goes off. That there's a desperate need to, you know, appreciate and engage with the moment of happiness because it doesn't last. You know, his reflection in the wind hover when he says, "My heart in hiding," that life can be difficult, and he struggles with that. You know, and nowhere is that more evident than in those terrible sonnets. No worse there is none, and when I wake and feel the fell. Like, listen, my cries heave, herds long, huddle in amain, a chief woe, which is then followed by world sorrow. Like, it's incredibly visceral. You know, the sense of his pain is communicated with such clarity. You know, that alliteration of the H, the use of language there, like he's not hiding the truth of his experience. Again, the sense of shock, the sense of post-traumatic stress that he's experienced when he says, "What sights you heart saw, ways you went." You can hardly get the words out. It's like he's panting, talking about the trauma of where his mind goes at night time. And in Felix Randall, one of the most beautiful poems that, you know, I've ever read, he talks about his experience of being a priest, and, you know, how he tries to bring comfort to those who are suffering, but he talks about how it impacts on him. It's not easy. He says, "This seeing the sick endears them to us to it endears." And then he follows up that wonderful image of him wiping the tear from Felix's cheek. So really, you know, this is lyric poetry. This is poetry which is personal and honest and reflective and confessional. It's beautiful, beautiful writing. The language is often dramatic. You know, while he can be very complicated, he can often be very direct as well. He's always inventive. And there are so many examples. There are so many examples of his inventive use of language. One of my favourite ones is when he says, "He rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing." He's describing the wind hover flying along and then just coming to a halt, like when you're on a horse and you pull the reins, you ring the reins. So he's describing the bird just coming to a stop. And then the wimpling wing, he's describing how the bird's feathers, how its plumage kind of are blown by the wind. So that's what wimpling means, like the movement of the feathers. Fantastic imagery. Really, really, really creative. I love from spring when weeds and wheels shoot long and lovely and lush. Look at that imagery. You know, it's like something, it's cinematic in quality. It's like something from one of those nature documentaries, you know, where they fix a camera on like a piece of ground where a seed has been sown, and then the camera stays there for months watching this first sprout come up, or the first growth come up, and then as it grows and eventually blossoms. This is Hopkins doing that before cinema was created. He's doing that with language. He's creating this vivid imagery when weeds and wheels shoot long and lovely and lush. Just brilliant. And in spring, that question, what is all this juice and all this joy? And then his reference to the sweet and the sour experiences of life, and his allusions to Eden's garden, you know, and this idea that life, you know, the appeal to the gustatory sense, this idea that life can be sweet but also bitter and sour. That's what experience can be like. So his language is dramatic, it is inventive, it is memorable, and it is impactful. Thematic concerns. He's a Catholic priest, and you know, inscape is an important concept to consider. It's complicated, but I don't think you need to overcomplicate it too much. It essentially, and I know that there'll be loads of people who are big Hopkins fans will hear this and say, no, that's what it means. But you're doing your leaving cert, don't overcomplicate it. Essentially, when I look out the window there and I see a tree and I see a leaf on a tree and I see, you know, a bird eating from the bird feeder, there's God. God is all around us. God is built into our work. Because our world is created by God, God is everywhere. And that omniscience of God is something which he feels. And that's essentially what inscape means for our purposes anyway. So like when he sees a thrush's egg, he says they look little low heavens in spring. Love that. So the thrush is a songbird. The egg is a reproductive cell. When he sees the miracle of life, of renewal of life, he sees God. God is there. God is everywhere. When he asks, why do men not wreck his rod in God's grandeur? He's saying, why don't people recognize that God is everywhere? Why do people ignore God's laws when it's so patently obvious that he's everywhere? Just look around you. In God's grandeur again, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. If you want your soul to be refreshed, if you want to be renewed, if you want to be redeemed, commune with nature, because that's where God is. And then, of course, the wind hover, which is devoted to Christ our Lord, or dedicated to Christ our Lord. His poetry isn't just about, you know, joy. We know that. It's also about and that's why the Dickinson parallel is also notable here. It's also about the extreme. His poetry is about the extremes of human experience. So there's intense joy and intense celebration, but there's also, you know, real, you know, difficult suffering, and they're captured in the terrible sonnets. So many great lines, you know. Comforter, where is your comforting? Another great example of repetition. You know, God, who he believes is everywhere, has abandoned him. Mary, mother of us, where is your relief? Which is the next line in that poem. You know, dearest him that lives alas away. I've talked about that. That's God has abandoned him. And then in the same poem, the idea that the reason he's suffering is because somehow he's innately sinful and God is punishing him. God's most deep decree, bitter would have me taste. You know, that God is punishing him for his sins. So his religion is a fundamental part of his life experience, but so is this suffering. And whether you're religious or not, you can just understand when you read those terrible sonnets, or when you read Felix Randall, or even when you read The Wind Hover, he talks about my heart in hiding, that this is a man who has experienced very difficult times in his life, and he captures that experience in his poetry. Then the idea of mortality. I just think Felix Randall is such an important poem. You know, it's such an important poem. I think it's an unusual Hopkins poem on the course. It's different. It's a narrative poem. It's about somebody else, but it's also about the poet's experiences of life, and it's about mortality. And it's about, you know, the idea that we are frail and fragile, and life is, there's nothing certain in life. And he captures that in that brilliant final sequence of Felix Rand. I know you're not going to learn the whole thing, but like this idea that like we never really think when we're young or when we're fit, when we're healthy, how quickly things can change. And he captures it in those lines, how far then from forethought of all thy more boisterous years. So he's talking about like when you're sick and old, or when you're sick and broken by sickness, you know, your the years of strength and youth and vitality, they seem far away when there with the random Grimforge, powerful amongst peers, one of my favourite lines from him, did fettle for the great grey dray horse, his bright and battering sandal. And this image of like Felix in his prime, you know, even amongst other farriers or blacksmiths, he was even then he was powerful even compared to them. And Felix, like, you know, holding the horse's hoof in his hand, the power of him, the strength of him to do that, hammering in the shoe into him. And this image, this juxtaposition of that with what Felix became, you know, broken by pining, and broken by the 4 fatal disorders. So it does make you think about the reality that there is no security. We are all vulnerable. There is a finite quality to our lives and our experiences. And I think that's tremendously interesting and thought-provoking. I just want to talk about sprung rhythm now very quickly to end the poem. I mentioned Inscape. And sprung rhythm is the only poet that ever, you know, is associated with this is Hopkins. And I suppose, like, well, okay, I'll do this in 30 seconds. Hopkins was an innovator. So his work was different from poetry that went before it. Now, there's so much of his poetry that is traditional. But one of the things that he did was he broke the rules of meter. Now, meter is the traditional idea that lines should have so many beats to create a rhythm, give a musical quality. So when a poem is recited out loud, it has that beats or that cadence. And Hopkins kind of wrote within meter, but made up his own meter. And essentially that's what sprung rhythm means. He was inspired by the rhythms of Welsh, the Welsh language. And if you ever heard any Welsh words, they often have many syllables. And sprung rhythm essentially means that he didn't, while he sometimes wrote in iambic or troic, dimeter, that wasn't meant to happen, pentameter or tetrameter, you know, those traditional forms. He also then kind of ignored them and wrote lines that, you know, conform to his own requirements, his own rhythm, in the way poets do today. And Hopkins is often seen as like the crucial poet in the birth of modern poetry. Like, so if you're reading someone like Tracy K. Smith or Plath, you're reading poets who are writing with a freedom brought about by the fact that Hopkins kind of broke the rules. Is that too much of a stretch? Probably. But is that something that's notable in his work? I think so. But I want you to remember, sprung rhythm means that he wrote with meter. His poetry has a metrical structure. It always has a beat. It always has rhythm. It's always, you know, got that musical quality. But he wrote in his own voice, and he wrote within his own metrical patterns. And that's what's important on that. I've written about Hopkins for years. I've discussed him with people for years. It's not something that's ever come up as being hugely important. But if you're stuck on it, sure, we'll talk about it further in class. I'll show you more examples. But it simply means that he wrote poetry which fitted to his requirements and didn't necessarily conform to rules set down by somebody else. An original, and I'll say it one last time, and innovative writer, Gerard Manley Hopkins.